Okay, well, we'll get started here. I am so happy to be able to interview you. I've interviewed Chuck Cape and I've interviewed Russell Vaudry, and I noticed that I watched some of your videos and gotten a few questions from that, but I will have some questions to ask you, and I'll start it out with, what is your name?
Hilbert, and my nickname is Hibby, Hibby. Last name is Margol, Margol.
Yes. And I got the email that showed some of the pictures from your trip to Normandy that the news had covered. And TJ Jorgen had said, this is our Hibby. He's here in Normandy. And so that's pretty cool. Where and when were you born?
February 22nd, 1924, Jacksonville, Florida, the oldest of identical twin boys.
Yeah, by how much?
10 minutes.
Oh,
What
wow.
my mother told us later was 10 minutes. I have to take her word for it.
Usually it's shorter than that. Usually it's just a few minutes apart.
No,
Wow. How old does that make you now?
100.
Wow.
So February 22nd of this year, I was 100.
Wow. Now, for the record, what war did you serve in?
World War II, France and Germany.
France and Germany, yes. Where were you when you found out about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and how did you feel about it?
Well, my twin brother and I were seniors in high school. In those days, they had what they call midtermers. So we graduated in January of 42, a little over a month after Pearl Harbor. And I remember it was a Sunday, and President Roosevelt came on the radio. In those days, we didn't have television. Everybody had a radio. So the radio usually was playing most of the time during the daylight hours and the evenings, of course. And I remember when President Roosevelt came on the radio and made his speech, which I happen to have a copy of the original that I acquired some years ago by accident, with his handwritten notes of his changes, his additions, and so forth. But I remember that speech very well, not the speech itself, word for word, but the event itself.
When the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened and with FDR's speech, how did you feel about both of those?
Well, friends, neighbors, relatives all rushed to join the military, knowing that it was going to be a war. And a lot of them were signing up for one of the branches of the military. My twin brother Howard and I, we wanted to go to college. And we knew at some point we'd have to serve in the military, but we wanted to get in as much college as we could. So we were home just maybe a week or 10 days in January of 42. We went to the University of Florida, which was only 90 miles away from Jacksonville, and entered as freshmen. So we joined, they had a ROTC unit there, horse-drawn 105 millimeter howitzers. So we joined the ROTC and became trained as gunners on 105 millimeter howitzers. The horses were real, the howitzers were real.
The rifles or the howitzers?
No, the rifles were made out of wood. The howitzers were real. They were our Army uniforms were riding pants, jodhpurs, because sometimes we had to ride on the horses. Sometimes we had to lead the horses. The horses pulled the howitzers. And that was our training. And then in October of 1942, Army officer came to campus and spoke to the ROTC students and said, if you join an Army Reserve unit, there's a good chance they'll let you remain in college until you get your degree. So Howard and I bet October 25th, 1942, we joined the Army Reserve Unit. In January of 43, they called our reserve unit to active duty.
So when was your official date? That
Um,
January?
Yeah, of 43, they called us to active duty, but they allowed us to finish that semester. So we had to report to Camp Landing, Florida, April the 3rd of 1943.
Now, you know, with you being an ROTC, one of the questions I ask veterans is if they enlisted or if they were drafted. But if you were an ROTC, isn't that kind of like enlisting?
No, it's Reserve Officers Training Corps.
Mhm.
Of course, we were freshmen. Some of the seniors and juniors, when they were in ROTC, but when they either they had joined a reserve unit previously, or they just went and signed up, joined the Army, they became officers because they were officers in the ROTC, so they were pretty well trained. So some became lieutenants, captains, majors, whatever, as soon as they signed up with the Army.
Where did they send you for basic training?
Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which more recently is, I think, called Camp Liberty, North Carolina. 13 weeks of basic training, also as gunners on 105 millimeter howitzers. It was mechanized, not horse-drawn. We had Army trucks that would carry the howitzers. We had a driver in the front and a sergeant in the co-pilot seat, so to speak, and then the corporal and the other 7 soldiers. We sat in the back of the truck. So 13 weeks of basic training, we were interviewed and offered the opportunity, since we had had some ROTC training plus the basic training, all on 105 millimeter howitzers. We were offered the opportunity to go to officer candidate school. And we said, well, what would that involve? And they said, well, 3 months, you'd both come out as second lieutenants.
Wow.
They called them 90-day wonders. We looked at each other and said, well, if we accept that, they're not going to keep us together. We'll come out as second lieutenants. They'll split us up, and we want to stay together. 3-month officers candidate school. Well, they call it 90-day wonders.
3 months officers
They would
training
all
school.
come out as second lieutenants, but it didn't mean they all came out with the same brain power. There was a difference, as I experienced in the 42nd Infantry Division later. But anyhow, so they said, well, the Army has just decided to start a new program, ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. We said, what's that about? And they said, well, they'll send you to some university, take courses in engineering. Well, going back to some college or university? Yeah, well, that's us. So we were ready to go. So anyhow, we ended up at Syracuse University. And after 3 or 4 months there, we took courses in engineering. And Syracuse University was the first time we saw snow. We'd never seen snow before.
Wow.
That was November, December of 1943.
Wow.
They transferred us to University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Same thing, taking courses in engineering. After 3 or 4 months there, some bright gentleman in Washington decided they had thousands of young soldiers, 18, 19 years old soldiers in college. They needed them for combat. So they disbanded the program, and that's when they split us up. They sent me to the 42nd Infantry Division in Oklahoma. They sent my brother Howard to the 104th Timberwolf Division in the Mojave Desert in California. And so anyhow, when I arrived at the 42nd Infantry Division for 2 or 3 months, they put me in the infantry. Even had me go to a firing range and qualify M1 rifle, which was infantry, not artillery. So they woke up finally and transferred me over to the artillery where I belonged with all my training, again as a gunner on a 105 millimeter howitzer. Meanwhile, my brother Howard was in the 104th Infantry Division in the infantry and on the Mojave Desert training for the North African campaign. And after a few months there, they decided they didn't need any more forces for the North African campaign, so they moved his division to Colorado, the Pikes Peak area in Colorado. And here he was carrying a 45-pound base plate of a mortar base plate, and leading a pack mule with the rest of the mortar and the ammunition up and down Pikes Peak. Not a happy soldier. So he put in 3 requests for transfers to his captain to be transferred to my outfit in Oklahoma, where I was a gunner on what we were trained for. So nothing happened. He went to his captain after a while and he said, "What's the status of my transfer request?" And the captain said, "My job is to train you, not transfer you."
Your mother got involved with writing letters to try to.
That was the point where Howard wrote home to our mother that the status was he was stuck where he was at, and we wanted to serve together again. So she wrote a letter to President Roosevelt requesting exactly that. She wanted us to serve together, and we wanted to be together. So luckily, she got a letter home from the White House, not signed by the president, but by some general that was the president's aide, saying that as a 2-star mother, her request would be granted. And in more recent years, I was able to obtain that original letter and the envelope, which I ended up donating to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There was a second letter from the War Department basically saying the same thing. So we didn't know whether I'm going to him or he's coming to me. Fortunately, the third letter came from the 104th Division headquarters saying that Howard would be transferred to my division in Oklahoma. Cause for celebration. Well, his captain tried to talk him out of accepting the transfer order. Howard said, "Look, I'm a soldier. I obey military orders. I'm ready to go." The captain sent him up to division headquarters, interviewed by a colonel, said the very same thing. Howard told him the same thing. He's ready to go. So the colonel said, "You must know somebody important in Washington, because these orders didn't come through normal channels."
Right.
So Howard said, "I don't know anybody in Washington. I'm ready to go." So the colonel had somebody, Jeep driver, take him down to the train station, put him on a train to come to Oklahoma. And that's how we got back together.
You know, I think it's amazing how much you've given your voice to different levels of people hearing your story. And for me, this is all about what I want to do too on my end, is to share this is one project. I want to be able to share you guys' story, but I'm wanting to create a TV show that brings people together, that shows them that by being involved in the community, that they can do the same thing and they can come together. And I hope it can make a difference for our country, for our hearts to know that we can be here for each other. Now, you were telling me about the training part of it, and your brother had just gotten with you at the 4600 Division.
Second Division.
Second Division.
Rainbow Division.
Yes, I read that.
Which, by the way, can you see the shirt that I put on special for you?
I can't see it. I see like to here is the black part. If you want to, you could stand up so I could see it.
Just a little bit.
Oh, I love that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, well, this is one of the garments when we got over to Normandy. This is one of the 4 or 5 garments. Well, they gave us, before we left Atlanta, they gave us this very nice jacket. Has a division and information all on it. But then when we got over there, they told us leave room in our check-in suitcase, leave some space for some additional things, gifts and whatever. We got over there, they gave us 3 different short sleeve shirts, which couldn't wear it over there really. I didn't bother. But then they gave us another lighter zipper jacket and even, would you believe, long john underwear, because they told us to pack all winter clothing. They sent us a list of what to pack. And they said, take all winter clothing, gloves, long john underwear, winter wear. And they were correct, because they said it's never warm in Normandy. It's always either cool or cold.
Cold.
And believe me, there were periods where it was cold. Even the day that of the medal ceremony, sitting up on the stage by myself for quite a while, I had long john underwear on that I had taken with me, and I was still cold. And I had gloves, whatever. But anyhow, back to your questions.
Yes. And one thing I have to say with that, when you earlier said that the first time you saw snow, you were like early 20s, that had to also have been an experience once you were serving in France and Germany. The cold, I'm from Michigan originally, so I know what the cold is, but I'm acclimated to where we are now, been that way for almost 35 years.
Okay.
But oh gosh, I couldn't imagine. Let's get back to the questions that we have. Now, after one thing that I was going to say in regards to after FDR's declaration, this is a question that I ask people when I'm doing the interviews. What did you recall about the surge of patriotism that you saw the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, everybody I knew, some kids that I graduated high school with in January of '42, especially guys that I was closest to on the football or basketball, high school football or basketball team. Most of them a lot of them immediately signed up for the military, one branch or another. I had a first cousin that very close to. He was about a year younger than me, a little less than a year, and he immediately signed up. He wanted to go in the Air Corps, which he was admitted to, wanted to be a pilot. He was a small guy, but he didn't make pilot training, but he ended up in the ground crew in the Pacific, ground crew of a bomber group or something. So everybody I knew, and then I had another friend that was a couple of years older than me. He went into the Air Corps, and I remember he took training as a pilot at Maxwell Airfield in Alabama. And unfortunately, he was killed in a training accident. Never got very far. So, these things were all happening around us.
Right. Because you guys were still learning, people were still learning about planes. When I talked to Russell, that's one thing that we talked about. The planes hadn't, really, even before World War II, planes hadn't been around for very, very long. So you'd still were having some accidents and things like that would happen in the course of these moments. Now, after basic training, well, your lieutenant training that you were able to have, where were you sent? What was your MOS?
Well, as I said, we went to Syracuse University and University of Illinois, courses in engineering, which was somewhat Greek to me and my brother because we were, as part of the University of Florida, we wanted to major in business, accounting especially, and a minor in economics. So accounting, economics, that was what we were looking forward to because our dream was to get a degree from the University of Florida and then go to the Wharton School of Finance, University of Pennsylvania, to get a master's degree because we wanted to become CPAs.
After you had received your training in the United States, when you were sent overseas, where was your MOS?
Well, it just so happened, what happened was when the Battle of the Bulge broke out, they decided to take the 3 infantry regiments as a gunner on a 105 millimeter howitzer. My gun battery consisted of 4 howitzers. My twin brother was a gunner on number 2. I was a gunner on number 3. So the 4 howitzers, we were in direct support of the infantry troops in front of us, the way it worked in combat. So anyhow, they rushed our 3 regiments, infantry regiments, back over as fast as they could get them over there. They got in the last 2 days of the Battle of the Bulge. So anyhow, then they moved them to a supposed quiet area near Strasbourg, France. I think it was just north of Strasbourg, France. But they had no, the rest of the division, we were on our way to France, but they had no support whatsoever. Just the 3 infantry regiments without the rest of the division being there. I think they loaned them 1 tank or something. So anyhow, they had casualties, killed, wounded, captured. So this became good fortune for the rest of the division because when we landed in Marseille, France, mid-January of 1945, we couldn't go in combat right away because the 3 infantry regiments had to get replacements. So the replacements, most of them were fresh out of basic training. They had to be trained. They had to get some kind of training to go into combat. So that delayed the rest of the division into going into combat. So we actually didn't go into combat for some weeks a few weeks yet, because we were like on maneuvers like we used to do in Oklahoma with the whole division so that the replacements could get training. So here we're like on maneuvers around the French countryside like we were in Oklahoma previously, until suddenly one night close to midnight, we got orders to pull over into a particular village and dig in our howitzers, put up camouflage nets, and dig nearby foxholes. Well, we thought this was part of the final training. But then early the next morning, first light, shells started flying over our heads. Then we realized, hey, this must be the real thing. And in daylight hours, we were able to realize that we were dug in on one side of the Oder River. The locals called it a river. We called it a wide creek. On the other side was what the locals called a mountain. We called a very high hill. So the Germans were dug in on the other side of that so-called mountain. And they were firing at targets behind us, the heavier howitzers, the 155 millimeters and the 240 millimeters behind us, they were firing over our heads towards the Germans. So it took us 2 or 3 days. You could tell by the difference in the sound between the German shells over our heads going to targets behind us and the shells that the heavier howitzers behind us were firing at targets over past the high hill across the river. So that was the position we found ourselves in. And then we were in that position for maybe 4 or 5 days. And then we moved north of France, different villages, cities, towns, and so forth.
Where specifically at that point were you in France?
Well, different towns. You see, the way it worked, we never set up our howitzers inside any town, village, city, because that's where the infantry guys were. So we were always on the outskirts of the towns and villages. And we had 2 forward observers, one on the ground with the infantry, with a soldier with him to dig his foxhole and so forth, and to be his radio operator so that he could give target information back to our command post where our howitzers were. We had another forward observer. Both of them were second lieutenants fresh out of West Point. And the other one was flying by himself in a small Piper Cub airplane, flying over German lines, selecting targets, and also radio the target information back to the command post, where we had a second lieutenant who was our battery executive. And then each howitzer had a field telephone. So the lieutenant in the command post receiving these fire missions to hit targets, then he would relay through the field telephones the fire missions that we actually responded to. It didn't matter where we were at, morning, noon, or night. We had to stay within a few feet or yards of the howitzers, especially me as a gunner, because we had sleeping bags. So after dark, we would be in our sleeping bags, zipped up, trying to go to sleep, get some rest, except for one soldier that had to be on guard duty, awake at all times. So as soon as the field telephone rang after dark, we immediately figured it's got to be a fire mission. So unzip the sleeping bag, jump up, and as a gunner, I'm already starting to make preparations. The instruments that I had to deal with, and except for 2 or 3 occasions, maybe 4, it was a fire mission. So it didn't matter what the weather was. Rain, sleet, snow, very cold. That's where we were.
When you were setting up and you guys were doing this from town to town, were there any battles that stood out to you, or situations that were
Well, the way
scary?
it worked, since we were always on the outskirts of towns and villages, cities, whether it was Würzburg, Schweinfurt, Nuremberg, whatever, and a lot of smaller towns and villages, sometimes our 4 howitzers would be quite a distance apart. The furthest apart was when we were positioned at a German air base in a suburb of Nuremberg. And our 4 howitzers were very far apart at that point. Other times they were closer together. The closest together our 4 howitzers ever were was when we reached Dachau. And they were very close together because of wooded area, and there was only enough open clearing just to accommodate the 4 howitzers. Then once we hit targets and air power hit some targets, tanks fired at some targets that were impeding the infantry guys. Once the targets were hit, infantry guys were able to move through that village, town, or city. Then we hooked our howitzers back up to the truck, and then we would ride through that city, town, or village, and we would see the destruction, but we had no way of knowing which destruction was caused by our firing, or which ones were caused by tank firing, or which ones were fired by aerial firing.
So all you could see was the destruction, and you know, I'm sure that was overwhelming. As you're talking about having to go from town to town and showing us what this is like you've done a great job of just giving a description of what it was like for you and your fellow soldiers to do the work that you guys were doing. What were some of the outskirts of these towns that you were at? What were some of the locations near?
Well, I just, I could look up my schedule notes and quotes from towns. I just didn't try to remember. Wingen-sur-Moder was one of them. That was the village of Wingen on the Moder River was one of them. I remember for a very definite reason, because when we were there, they told us there was a glass factory in the area. No one could go inside that glass factory. If they did, they would be subject to court-martial. We just knew there was a glass factory, and we didn't mess with it because we didn't want to be court-martialed. Well, many years later, we found out that glass factory was actually the Lalique crystal factory. And there's a whole story and history that I'm aware of Lalique crystal, but that's another whole story. But they just called it a glass factory. And amazingly enough, when I first met one of the Delta executives here in Atlanta, that originally born and raised in France, I asked her, did she know about a factory, a famous factory in Wingen-sur-Moder, France, and she didn't know. I asked other French people, they didn't know. I even asked somebody from the French consulate here, they didn't know. President Macron of France, if he was familiar with a factory world famous in France, and he said no, which surprised me. In fact, I told him in one quick conversation that if they moved that factory to the United States, everybody in the world would know about it.
That's right. That's right. That's amazing, though. That's weird that people just didn't know about it. If it was so popular, why did people not know? With all your journeys and where you were sent to, with all these different towns that you went to, about how long before you had to go on that assignment to liberate the camp, how long were you going from town to town to help liberate these other small towns?
Well, it just depended. It was different from one town to the next. Würzburg comes to mind, which was a much larger city. We were on the outskirts, like elsewhere. I remember we went through France, we went through the Hart Mountains. It was snowing, it was cold. I have some pictures taken of that. Just pictures that you normally see most anywhere going through a mountainous area when it's snowing. And you were impeded at times with maybe a turned over tank or something, a partially destroyed, whether it was a German tank, American tank. We had to wait until the wrecker came, big, huge wrecker came to move it and things like that. So it varied from day to day.
Wow. I imagine that was quite a sight to see a tank be moved by a wrecker. I'm sure that took time for it to move, and get out of the way.
One thing, well, some of them were burned out too, because they had direct hits. But the one thing I remember about that, the driver of this huge, and by I mean huge wrecker, was the smallest guy that you could possibly imagine. It's a little guy that was behind him that drove this huge uh, thing that moved these tanks and whatnot. But and then sometimes across a river, you had to cross over on a pontoon bridge because the regular bridge was blown up. The Germans retreating, so the scenery changed a lot. I do remember the first time that we had an event after we crossed the Rhine River into Germany. Was not too far. Was called Don, D-A-H-N, Don, Germany, and that's when we got it. After it was under control, we got a 2-day rest period, which is another whole story that I don't have time in this session.
And with what you said about being right there at the line with France and Germany, I was wondering about that you were on the border, and that's why you served in both places.
Right.
And so that was the reason why it was just basically they were where you were serving, it was all together in one area that connected with France and Germany.
We were basically, I think, what they call the Alsace region of France, which had a lot of German-speaking people. And Germany really wanted that whole area from French. Even before the war, they wanted that whole area. And that was the first area they took. And then that's why combat took place in that whole area. Strasbourg and closer to the German border. That was basically the area. There were towns like, I don't know, Ludwigshafen or something.
After we go, I'm going to look up those towns to see what it looks like on the map, to see where that's at.
Well, if you look at Strasbourg on the map and then look to the right, that area between Strasbourg and the German border.
Strasbourg and the German border. I'll look that up because I get curious about things like this. But I'm going to let you go for now. I hope you have a great lunch with your friends. Your friends are going to come get you, or family?
No, my wife and her part-time caregiver. That's who called me on the phone.
Well, you guys have fun, and thank you so much for your time now. And I'm so honored to hear more of your story. You have a great day.
Just send me an email when you want to repeat this.
Yes, I will let you know, and I'll ask you what's convenient for you for next week, okay?
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
bye. You have a great day too.